government, they are being rapidly brought from their state of comparative savagery and barbarism to one of civilization.
You don't want to see this, boy. It's going to tell me off.
We have just finished our journey from the Fort Niagara to the White House to invite the President, Chief White Father, to attend the Four Nations celebration at the Fort Niagara in September.
I want to talk to you about the 5 policies of the United States relating to Native people. Now, I want to be clear here that all 5 policies constitute genocide. And as I go through them, and I'll explain each one, I'll list each one, then I'll explain each one. But all 5 of them meet the definition. And by definition, what I'm referring to is that genocide has a list of things that constitute genocide, but all of them fall under one definition, which is creating the conditions that cause a people to cease to exist as the people they once were. So anything that you do that creates a condition that causes a people to cease to exist is genocide. It's not just murder. It's not just sterilization. It's not just ethnic cleansing, as people have come to know. It's creating any condition that causes a people to cease to exist. So first, let me list what the 5 policies were. And I want to be clear again. These are not policies. They're only loosely sequenced. So they aren't a policy that starts and stops for another one to begin. They overlap. Sometimes elements of these policies exist all at the same time or 2 or 3 at a time. But here they are. It's extermination, removal, assimilation, termination, and then self-determination. Now, the last one sounds kind of benign, but we'll get into that. But let me explain what each policy meant. On its face, extermination seems obvious. It's the murder. It's the slaughter. It's the massacres. It's the intentional spread of disease, smallpox, blankets. And some of this goes back prior to the colonies being established both as British colonies and then ultimately establishing themselves as states. So some of these policies predate the United States as an entity. But extermination is something that would have roots in Columbus's landing in the Caribbean, but it also would be tied to the paying bounties for scalps, mass murders, executions, the intentional spread of disease, as I say, including disease that was allowed to spread in residential schools. So we're talking about extermination existing from the United States origins right up until the end of what they consider the Indian Wars, the massacre at Wounded Knee, right through the periods of time in the residential schools where there was sterilization programs that were going on that was also geared towards the extermination of a people, and of course the intentional allowance for disease to spread through residential schools. So extermination is On its face, it sounds like, oh, that's just what they did in the very beginning. No, it continued through a lot of through almost our entire existence as Native people within the relationship with the United States. Now, removal is oftentimes associated with the Trails of Tears and Andrew Jackson, but removal would begin right from the start. It would be a part of what the early colonies were trying to do, get Native people to leave their territories. And removal would also be associated with things like land use, coming right up until fairly modern times with the Kinzua Dam project and the Senecas having 10,000 acres condemned by the Army Corps of Engineers to create a dam that would protect Pittsburgh from flooding. So removal has to do with removing our ability to use land, not just physically moving us along these trails of tears like the Cherokee and the Choctaw and so many other people had faced. So removal is a policy that also has its roots with Thomas Jefferson, with what he called the Louisiana Purchase, because when he sold that whole idea to the southern states, it was that that they would purchase this land with the intent of moving Native people to these lands. So while it's directly associated with Andrew Jackson and the Removal Act, the removal policy would begin with from the first president all the way through with what we're seeing with taking lands for pipelines and for any number of other land uses that clearly show us as sacrifice zones for our territory and sacrifice collateral damage for development. So that's removal. Assimilation is also a policy that has its roots from the very beginning to something that we're experiencing today. Assimilation is this idea of trying to indoctrinate Native people to abandon their culture, to create the cognitive dissonance associated with living a life that is contrary to what our culture has presented to us, forgoing the concept of 7 generations. Assimilation was tied to not only reducing our land masses, so we would have to change what we did to sustain ourselves, pushing people who were not traditionally farmers into farming, pushing Native people who farmed a certain way to farm a different way. The idea of changing how we sustained ourselves both financially and from a food supply standpoint. This idea of assimilation would be one that would punish our children for speaking the language, our own languages in our schools. It would actually outlaw many of our languages, much of our culture, much of what we would associate with our identity. There's an irony that while we were being forced through these assimilation processes to drop our identity, non-Native people would pick up our images and play Indian and with school mascots and with pro teams and that kind of stuff. This assimilation process is something that has our children pledging allegiance to a flag at 5 years old in kindergarten in public school. Assimilation is tied to the false narratives of history, teaching that Columbus discovered us. All of this stuff, this indoctrination, is tied to assimilation. Now, termination is one of the policies that did come to an end. What termination was geared towards was the idea that when we were removed from our lands, when our numbers were depleted through extermination, removed from our lands through the removal policy, and then assimilated, that the United States could take the position that they no longer needed to recognize us as Native people. So they could terminate what they called their trust responsibility to Native people. So any obligations that they owed for land cessions or any promises made in these treaties, they say, well, you're no longer that party anymore. You cease to exist as the people you once were. First, they worked to make us no longer be those people, and then say, now you are no longer those people, so we don't have to recognize you anymore. So termination became a process, a legal process that the United States adopted to insist that some Native peoples cease to exist. That clearly crossed a line. So the termination era came to an end, and then they began to really take hold of this notion of self-determination. Now, the problem with self-determination is that there are a couple of ways of defining self-determination. Self-determination in the international community is known as statehood. It's the idea of asserting yourselves as distinct governments with distinct lands and distinct authority over those lands. The United States, though, says when we say self-determination, self-governance, we don't mean the same definition as the international definition of self-determination. We mean internal self-determination. What they mean is that we have the right to govern ourselves within a framework dictated by the United States. So they create policies and they create laws that will shape how we govern, and that our governance will become part of the system of governance within the United States, almost as an attempt to municipalize our governing structures. They insist that while they encourage self-determination, they by no means recognize that we have the right to assert sovereignty over our lands. So we no longer have the right to determine what is in our best interest when it comes to our lands. So to the extent the United States claims that they promote self-determination, they mean it in a very limited and in a very internal fashion. They by no means recognize us as a distinct people. So self-determination also starts to fit in with the assimilation programs because they shape us within this idea of self-governance and self-determination to only assert that distinction within the framework, state framework, or federal framework. And so we don't exist as a distinct people. So we don't truly have the right to determine our own policies and practices, laws, court systems, and all of that other stuff. We only get to emulate what the United States allows us to emulate within those policies. Now, the reason I mention these 5 policies is because all of these policies, as I said, constitute genocide, but they also lead to the poverty that exists on our territories, the unemployment that exists on our territories, the mental illness and the depression that exists on our territories. It creates environments where racism, a unique racism, exists to Native people that allows for missing and murdered indigenous women, that allows Native people to occupy prisons in a disproportionate fashion, that allows substance abuse to run rampant, and it allows law enforcement to ignore the crimes committed against our people by Americans, by Canadians, because of where we are located geographically. All of these policies have removed us from view, and these policies are very well established. And I didn't make these up. These are recognized as the policies of the United States, and all of them stand as stark violations of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and they all represent genocide. So I encourage you to take a look at some of these policies and how they've been implemented. And as you look at the policies and the practices of the United States, you can almost make your own determination on which policies, those laws, those enactments, those strategies of the United States, how they adopted them to shape who we would end up being. Thomas Jefferson once referred to creating an environment that would result in the final consolidation of land and people within the United States. That was his plan. And much of it sounds a lot like Hitler's final solution. But this was always the policy. The whole idea was that we would cease to exist as the people we were before colonization.
There's a heavy weight you've been trying to hold on to, but you can lay it all down with me, 'cause in the end I'm just trying to show you you don't need more pain and misery. You gotta hold on to what we got.
And I say with respect to the Native Americans that I go right back to where I was 2 years ago when I was campaigning. What do you have to lose? What do you have to lose?